Hi. In this video, I'd like to explore jealousy and envy. But first, I'd like to take a minute to thank a viewer, Now Phil Manasseh, for suggesting this topic as part of my Reconsidered series of videos. So, thanks to you, Now Phil Manasseh, if that's actually how you pronounce your name. Anyhow, to get started, probably we should first begin by taking a minute to distinguish between jealousy and envy, especially since common usage often conflates these two terms. In a footnote to its definition of jealousy, Webster's describes the fairly large degree of semantic overlap between jealousy and envy, but goes on to say that while both terms have to do with covetousness, jealousy has to do with a sense of zealous vigilance and protectiveness toward one's advantages, whereas envy has more to do with a painful or resentful awareness of an advantage enjoyed by another, joined with a desire to possess that same advantage. In other words, envy is more about wanting what other people have, whereas jealousy is more about guarding what we ourselves already have. Beyond this, however, it seems to me that another important difference, not noted in Webster's footnote, has to do with the emotional intensity of the two experiences. In his play Othello, Shakespeare refers to jealousy as the green-eyed monster, and it seems to me that jealousy, especially in the romantic sphere, often is a kind of emotional monster in a way that envy rarely is. And so, it's not terribly uncommon to hear of people murdering one another in a jealous rage, as in the case of Othello, but hardly ever in an envious rage. In other words, there's something about guarding what we have, or what we think we have, especially in the domain of our love life, that quickly brings out the enraged monster in us. And while envy can also be a powerful force in human affairs, it rarely takes the form of a raging monster. It's more like a gnawing hunger, annoying to be sure, but rarely murderous. However, whether we're coveting what other people have or trying to protect what we already have, it would seem that both envy and jealousy revolve around a sense of ownership. In other words, we experience them with respect to what we think of as ours or what we wish were ours. But of course, a construct like ours is interwoven with who we supposedly are in the first place. In other words, at a deeper level, jealousy and envy involve our identity. In the case of jealousy, it's about protecting our sense of who we are from being diminished by the threat of losing something or someone that we already have. In the case of envy, it's about wanting to possess something we desire so that we can expand our sense of ourselves to include it. And that's why jealousy and envy are such powerful emotional experiences for us. It's because what's really at stake is not whether we have X or Y or Z in our lives, but whether we can think of ourselves as the kind of person who has X or Y or Z in our lives, as the kind of person who's worthy of having X, Y, or Z. Advertisers have known this trick for a long time. They figured out a long time ago that people buy $100,000 cars not just to get around town, but to be seen as winners by other people, and more to the point, to see themselves as winners. And one of the easiest ways of feeling like a winner is to feel like we're being envied by other people. In the 1980s, James Carse wrote a great little book on game theory called Finite and Infinite Games, which I think would be helpful here. In it, he calls the sense of ourselves that's constructed in terms of ownership the territorial personality. In this regard, jealousy is especially emotionally powerful for us, first because losing something we have threatens to reduce the outer boundary of our territorial personalities. But more importantly, it makes it easy to think of ourselves as losers rather than as winners. Let's look at an example. Cheating in the romantic sphere. In the case of cheating, jealousy is powerful first because we can no longer define ourselves as a person who has a faithful spouse or lover. But more importantly, it makes it hard to see ourselves as a person who is worthy of having a faithful spouse or lover, as a person who is sufficiently attractive, engaging, and/or sexually proficient, for instance. Cheating arouses the monster of our jealousy because it makes it easy for us to think of ourselves as losers. It makes us feel like our value as human beings has been reduced. So, the agony of jealousy isn't so much about the threat of losing a lover or even a spouse, although that certainly is painful in its own right. After all, the fact is that there are always millions of potential lovers and spouses in the world. The real agony of jealousy is about losing our positive sense of ourselves. And that's why jealousy, especially in the romantic sphere, is such a horrific experience. However, the good news is that Karsa's analysis also holds open the possibility of moving beyond the territorial personality and hence beyond a lot of the misery of a jealous, envious relation to the world. But, of course, it can be pretty hard to imagine what that even looks like, especially since most of us have been pretty thoroughly indoctrinated into thinking of ourselves and valuing ourselves mostly in terms of our territorial personalities. So, what would a non-territorial identity even look like and feel like? Well, Karsa's book gives a very detailed and vivid description of that, but let me try to give you the gist of it here. Probably the first thing is that we would no longer define ourselves mostly in terms of ownership, or in terms of how we've won or lost in life's competitive contests. I would no longer be so quick to define myself as a college professor with a PhD who drives a white Jeep, for instance. Instead, I would start thinking of myself as a playful nomad, as an artist working in the medium of life itself, and as a participant in the spontaneously unfolding aesthetic of things. And then, eventually, maybe I would start thinking of myself how? Maybe as a song born upon the wind of time, lilting and echoing all too briefly across the auspicious skies of the world. Yeah, imagine putting that on your tax form. Occupation? I am a song born upon the wind of time. Yeah, God forbid that you should give them any kind of real answer to that question. But I digress. Anyhow, if we were able to pass beyond our territorial personalities, beyond our proclivity for petty jealousies and envy, we'd probably spend a lot less time trying to accumulate personal advantages by dominating and winning, and a lot more time participating in each other's lives joyfully and creatively. Life would be a lot less serious and a lot more playful. It would be less like trying to beat someone at arm wrestling and more like playing hacky sack with some friends. We'd probably spend a lot less time worrying about how we're being seen and judged by other people, or about how we see and judge ourselves, and a lot more time riding the ecstatic, ever-cresting wave of life. We'd learn to drop the habit of always trying to conquer, always trying to be right, always trying to outdo and one-up each other. And along with it, we'd drop the unsavory routine of always trying to justify ourselves, and above all, of always trying to win. And in place of all that, we would become infinite players in the boundless game of the universe. But at this point, the question is probably, well, how might we begin to move more toward that way of life and simultaneously pull ourselves out of the trap of always being ruled by our jealousies, our envy, and our territorial personalities? Personally, I find it helpful to become cognizant of the fundamental inevitability of victory and defeat, of both gaining and losing what we have, and hence to recognize their triviality in the greater scheme of things. As Rudyard Kipling once put it, it's helpful to learn to meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two imposters just the same. Personally, playing chess has helped me learn part of that lesson. In chess, some days, things just seem to go your way. You can see things on the board effortlessly, and a winning plan becomes immediately obvious. Then other days, it's the exact opposite of that. Everything seems murky and befuddled, and losing is incredibly easy. And most days are somewhere in between. And I find that the same basic logic applies to life itself. Some days we win, some days we lose, and still other days we draw. They're all pretty much inevitable in this life. So the point is that we can stop worrying about whether we'll be winners, because sometimes we will. And we can also stop worrying about whether we'll be losers, because sometimes we'll be that too. So the real point of chess and of life is not whether we're winners or losers, because they're both inevitable in any case. The real point is about what we experience, what we contribute, and how we grow along the way. And if all of that isn't a good enough reason to give up the territorial template for life, well, consider the reality we're inhabiting as human beings. Consider the immeasurable vastness of time and space that surrounds us, its infinite complexity, and its incomparable majesty. Consider the real depth of our souls, how staggeringly beautiful and terrifying we are in our depths, how full we are of all that's best of dark and bright. And consider the time of our lives, its clockwork cadence gradually unwinding as one moment gives way to the next, until we eventually make our meandering way through this existence. And then ask yourself, how much do our petty jealousies and envy and territorial concerns really matter within the larger, more encompassing scope of things? And if you're at all like me, oh God, perish the thought that you would be like me, but if you are, I think that you'll see pretty clearly that it all adds up to precious little. It's all just a way of trying to assert our illusory self-importance in a universe that far transcends it and that's completely indifferent to it. In reality, the universe doesn't actually care about our sensations of jealousy and envy, or whether we can convince ourselves that they're justified somehow. The universe is divinely indifferent to all of that kind of triviality. What the universe cares about, at least as far as I've seen, is giving birth to something beyond itself. Giving birth to a new order of boundlessness. Consequently, it cares about whether we can find it in ourselves to live toward the reality we're actually inhabiting, and whether we can summon enough courage to assume our rightful place within its ceaseless and infinitely subtle unfolding. And if you're still worried, well, maybe you can take solace in the fact that in the end, life will take everything we regard as ours away from us, including our lives themselves. It's just a matter of time, and not even a lot of time if we're honest about it. So, everything we jealously defend and everything we enviously covet, all of it's already in the process of dissolving whether we like it or not. And defining ourselves and the value of our lives in terms of what we're frantically trying to possess is nothing more than a childish exercise in futility. In reality, there's nothing to hang on to. There's nothing to jealously defend and nothing to enviously covet. And so, the agony we feel when we experience jealousy and envy is really about nothing more than the hunger pangs of our illusions. Nothing more than the whispers of phantoms that haunt us in the midnight of our childish dreams and fantasies. The reality is that the relationships we jealously guard, well, those relationships are always shifting and changing, already moving beyond themselves bit by bit, and there's nothing we can do about it. And we ourselves are changing too, right alongside them. And all the things we crave, well, all of those things are also dissolving in the swollen sea of time in which we swim, along with everything and everyone else in this universe. So, when you think about it, where are all of our petty jealousies and envy in comparison to that? Of course, realizing all of this doesn't necessarily make the experience of jealousy and envy disappear. They are, after all, extremely potent primitive human emotions, but I find that learning to see things from the wider perspective of a reality does help to keep them in check and can help us be not quite so thoroughly ruled by them. So, in the end, like addictions, perhaps jealousy and envy can serve as portals into the larger terrain of our personal and collective metamorphosis if we can summon the courage to work through them and eventually live beyond them. Just a thought. Have a great day.